Well, greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us and for subscribing to Three Questions and focusing on results. Joining me today is my longtime friend and who I prefer to call a reciprocal mentor. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, Eric, but Eric Bush. I simply don't recall when I didn't know you. I do know that was in a previous century, and I'm pretty sure I had hair. So that it's been a while. To the viewer, I think it's important that you know that Eric forged a successful career as a leader in law enforcement. He worked his way through the ranks from police officer and sergeant, captain, retiring ultimately as the chief of police in Prineville, Oregon. In addition, he crafted a quite exemplary career as a leader in the military, retiring as a two-star, a major general, and is still known as a leading global expert on large-scale non-combatant evacuation. He continues to provide his expertise and leadership as the Director of Emergency Management for Grant County, headquartered in John Day, Oregon. And he also provides private consulting to governments and businesses. He and his family continue to live in Central Oregon. It kind of gets in your blood, eh, General?
Oh, it does. It does. It's hard to give up that kind of service.
Absolutely. While we live here on the sun's corona in Arizona, um, I said that sounded like a whine. I intentionally moved here, so I can't complain about that. And we'll talk about owning your consequences in a little while. But I do miss Oregon. I miss the change of seasons. Everything's the same color here the whole year round. Every plant, animal, and insect wants to hurt you, and so I do miss Oregon, and I miss the wide open spaces in Central Oregon, particularly. You and I have some things in common. Among those are both of us growing up in a small town, a small county. Um, I'm pretty sure we all grew up in the same kind of small town. And I recall growing up, as you know, I grew up in the country in a small town just outside of Salem, Oregon, surrounded by a bunch of thousands of acres of dry land farming and a whole bunch of hardworking, down to earth folks. And as a kid, in my early teens and middle teens, I would get bored. I mean, there's only so many chores you can do, and I would get bored, and I'd go out and I'd just walk on the gravel road, on the dirt road out past where I lived, and I'd walk for miles and look at the surroundings, and I would think, is there a life out for me out there somewhere? Is there a larger world than this? Is this where I'm always going to be, or is there something else? And so I'd have my daydreams, and I have to tell you now, Eric, as I am out driving around, I'll see some kid walking along the highway and think, you know what? Hang in there. There is a life for you out there somewhere. You just have to be patient, stay in charge of your own destiny. Um, so it leads me to wonder, from you, coming from a small town, learning the lessons of hard work, and
Mhm.
ultimately becoming both a chief of police and a major general. Um, what would you tell that young person that's out, I don't know, bucking hay, which is probably an antiquated reference, or in their entry level job about taking charge of their own hopes and dreams for the future?
Well, I mean, you raise a great point, Steve, because we were talking earlier about looking into the future and trying to decide what things are going to look like, and that phase of your life when you're young, you're in your teens, like I was growing up in a in suburbs in California, and my family was all from Eastern Oregon. And so when I was a very young man, my mother and her sister had a great idea that I would go and work on the family ranch up in Eastern Oregon. And I did exactly that. And that was the lifestyle I really kind of picked for myself as far as who I was. It's really where I felt like I belonged. And so I worked on that ranch, and you learn a lot of lessons at those entry level jobs you referred to, regardless of what you're doing. For me, particularly, that generation that accepted me into the fold, if you will, on the ranch, they they taught me what it meant to be self-sufficient. They taught me what it meant to work, and laid the groundwork. And I tell people this every day, for all the things I've been able to do and been blessed to do in my life, they helped me lay the groundwork for who I am. And if it hadn't been for that experience, that entry level experience, that, you're getting up first thing in the morning, you're working all day long. You don't get paid an hourly wage because you're family, you get paid by the day. So it's summertime, and when everybody goes home at 5, you and your cousin, your uncle, you go out and you pull irrigation dams till dark and fight the mosquitoes. And then you come back in and you're exhausted. You may or may not feel even uh, so tired you don't want to eat, and you go to bed, and then you get up and you do it all over again. And you don't do it 5 days a week; you do it 6 days a week. And if you're lucky, there aren't any chores to do on Sunday of any consequence.
Yes.
But it's you learn lessons that you don't realize you're learning at the time. At the time, I felt like I was, you know, being abused to some degree, I suppose,
Exactly.
when I was 13,
Exactly.
14 years old. But as time went on, I really discovered those lessons, and they were very formative for me as growing up.
We take those lessons that at the time, as you mentioned, kind of look painful. It looked like we're being tortured or that people are out to get us. Um, I recall it being, working in the summer times, working in the bean fields, it being so exhausted that I'd fall asleep. Whether it was picking cherries or beans or cotton, whatever those things were, and I'd be so exhausted I would fall asleep. And and I thought at the time, as you mentioned, I thought I'm being tortured here. This is just awful. But you know what? Though learning how to sleep in the dirt is a pretty good skill if you want to be an infantry officer. That's
Mhm.
a really important kind of a skill. Um, that and hearing my father say, "What do you mean you want a break?" It's like those kind of things. So, um, would you tell me about the kind of lessons you learned in those days you relied upon over the years? I mean, you and I've talked before about your view of leadership and horses, for example. And I'll come back to a couple of other points, including that notion of thinking over the horizon. But what lessons did you learn in those days you relied upon over the years? Help build your
Well,
character.
right. Yeah. And again, that's a great question, because again, you learn lessons you don't even realize you're learning at the time. You
Mhm.
you figure out how to do things just as a matter of, at the time it feels like survival. It may or may not be. But when I was a young man working on the ranch, I was expected to catch my own horse and saddle my own horse and bridle my own horse. And there was no instruction manual. There were no lessons. I'd ridden a horse a couple of times as a younger kid, but I was just expected to do it. And and so catching these horses, if you can imagine, when we would go out to bring cattle in off of the federal land, off the allotments, we had to start fairly early because it was such a big job, as far as distance goes, on horseback. So we would start before daylight, and the horses would be in these series of corrals on the barn. And if you can imagine an old barn with one incandescent light in the gable, it's dark, and you've got half a dozen horses running in circles. They're excited, and I'm being hollered at to catch my horse and hurry up, and it's kind of a recipe for just a bunch of excitement. And when you have that kind of excitement, horses don't always respond the way you want them to. And the thing I learned was, when the horse saw the bridle, they would run, and you try to catch them and they'd run more. And so what I did was I discovered that if I just grabbed a piece of baling twine and wadded it in my hand, which was laying everywhere, I could walk up to a horse and they would just stand there because they didn't see me with a bridle. And I could put my hand over their neck and take the baling twine out slowly, and I'd caught my horse. And I got to the point where I was catching my horse before everybody else. But they thought what I was doing initially was silly. I should, that type of thing. But I could catch my horse real fast. And one of the big lesson I learned from that little aha moment, if you will, is a horse weighs 1,200 pounds. You can't make a horse do anything. You have to create the environment where the horse wants to do the things you need it to do to accomplish the job. And so, fast forward a little bit, I over the years I learned how to train horses, and I really discovered that if you understand the personality of a horse, what their needs, wants, and desires are, and you look at things through their perspective, you understand, you take the time to learn how they communicate, and they do with you, that you can get that 1,000 pound, that 1,200 pound animal to do just about anything you want it to do, and it will be loyal as heck if you treat them right. So that was a huge lesson, and I didn't even realize I was learning that lesson back then. But it taught me something that I was able to carry forward into my life and into my career dealing with people that I can tell you was just invaluable.
That's a great story. I can I can connect the dots, but perhaps for our viewers, if you connect the dots, I know you were a brigade commander before you became a general officer. That little lesson must have, because a brigade weighs a hell of a lot more than a horse. But still gotta lead, you still gotta inspire, still gotta have them think it's their idea. How did you apply that in that arena? How was the perspective different, if at all?
Well, it's you have to look at the whole organization and the culture and the personality of the organization. And when you come into a situation like a brigade, an infantry brigade is 3,000 people, and so you have, of course, the hierarchy and the chain of command, and you have your battalion commanders and your company commanders below them, and you have to really get to know them and understand the culture, not only in the brigade, I'd say the brigade headquarters, for instance, itself, but down to the company level. What does each one of those companies look like? How does it feel when they're doing their training exercises? And it's really important as a commander to get that 2 levels down. And again, you're learning the language of that particular subunit, that unit, and that unit would be probably the analogy to the horse, right? And so you learn what's important for that unit, and you look at things through that lens, and that's where that lesson kind of transferred over to managing a big organization like a brigade of 3,000, 3,500 soldiers.
No, that lesson, thank you. That lesson to me also applies itself to personal interactions in families, small units called families, small units called not-for-profit organizations or police departments or small businesses. I've learned along the way, General, I need to ask more than I tell. I need to listen more than I talk. Those things came through clearly in your analogy there. Um, how did life change from perspective? I use an analogy, and you've heard me do it a lot of times. The flight from San Francisco out to Hawaii, for example. The average person working on the flight crew, um, their their attention is right on the tarmac. They got like a 0-foot view of what's going on around here. And as you go up through the ranks, you have to adopt a totally different perspective from a 40,000-foot view. What changed for you when you became a general officer, either as a brigadier or as a major general? How did that perspective change? My view, and I don't want to lead the witness any more than I'm about to do, but I learned that most of the generals I've known in my life didn't concern themselves with the day-to-day stuff of running a unit.
Mhm.
Whatever we were counting at the company level or at the battalion level, they concern themselves with what does that mean? It's not what it is, it's what does that mean in terms of the larger strategic implications. I don't know if you concur with that or if you had a different experience.
Yeah, well, it's your perspective is different at every level. And one of the things that I've noticed with, particularly when I was working on the U.S. Forces Korea staff in Korea and in Indo-PACOM headquarters in Hawaii, that we'd have staff officers and they would develop their data and they would set their briefing up for the general to come, and the general would come in and they would provide the briefing, and the so what or the critique that I most often had to give, especially young and experienced officers, was you got to ask yourself from the general's perspective, so what? You tell them something, so what? Why is that important to the general officer? And so that forces you to have to look at a much higher level of what's going on. You go from figuratively from the 10,000 foot level as a field grade officer to the 50,000 foot level, where you're looking over the horizon and you're really looking at the enemy and understanding your adversary. For instance, I can't tell you how many books I read on North Korea and China, and it's because I wanted to and I needed to understand the culture and the philosophy of the leaders in a group that may or may not be my adversary. I mean, they could be an ally too, because that's important as well. So when you look at that, as a general officer, you start looking at things much more broadly. You have to take many more things into consideration, and you look at things as almost a cultural shift or a conceptual shift in the direction you're going.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So it's and I really was fascinated by that, because when you started looking at things from, for instance, the Chinese perspective, and the game Wei Qi, or also known as Go, it's a game where you have stones or chips now, but it's thousands of years old. But it's embedded into the Chinese culture, and the object of the game is there's two opponents, one to kind of move around on the board where you surround the other, and it's embedded into the culture, because if you look at their history and the three kingdoms and how they maneuvered around each other, it illustrates how they look at their world. And if you understand how things happen from their perspective, it's much more, you put yourself in a much better place to influence outcomes when you're dealing with that group, that country, that nation, or individual. So, I mean, it really, it's a concept that applies almost virtually at any level.
I concur. That's a good lesson for all of us. One of the things I work to get across to my students, and you've watched me do it over the years, and to consulting clients and friends, is that the world's like a balloon. You squeeze it here, it gets bigger somewhere else. It used to be when I was in an entry-level job, or just day-to-day life for that matter, I was so caught up in, I don't know, Eric, making today's pain go away, that I really didn't think about what are those consequences to those choices. And that's a pretty convenient self-victimization when you think about it, for many of us in life. And so it was only over the years that I gained, I don't know, maybe it's called wisdom. I gained the appreciation for understanding what are those consequences before I went and had the behavior, and assessing those, so that, well, the architects taught us form ever follows function.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started to understand what results do I want from this, what's most likely to happen, that started to change my perspective on what choices I made today, so that I was streaming that to the consequence that I wanted, or at least it was most likely if I had that behavior choice. And so that's a good lesson for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of skipping to another question. I believe these are all integrated, but you and I have spoken many times about the value of telling stories.
Mm-hmm.
Would you address that for us?
Sure.
I'll come back to a subset of that in a moment, but where, from your perspective, is the value of telling stories? Again, whether that's in a family, or in forums like we're in right now, or to very large groups of people as a leader, where's that value? What does it accomplish?
I can't overstate how significant the importance is of telling stories. To some degree, music is even involved in this. It's almost something that's ingrained in our DNA, that we want to hear stories from a perspective. And just to kind of tie this together with experience, I was actually out on the ranch yesterday that I grew up on, and I was there with my cousins, who are all real little but are now in their 50s running the ranch, and my aunt, who's in her 70s now, and we were telling stories about the time I got bucked off a horse when I was 15, and how people who were there reacted to it and what they thought about me at the time, and it was completely different than the way I perceived it. And every time I go back to the ranch, we tell stories to each other about remember when, this happened or that happened, because there was so much of that. And I hear things from a little different perspective. And I think, wow, is that really what you thought? Because I didn't see it that way, but I could totally understand that. And so, and I just really believe that people, some of the best results I've gotten when I've engaged groups is when I've told a story that is analogous to whatever the subject matter is, whatever the challenge is, and the potential solutions are. Um, and when you think about, picking courses of action, like you talked about earlier, making choices in your life, what could happen? What's the worst thing that could happen? And that falls into the realm of risk management, which is super important in the fields that I've been involved in. And what's the worst thing that could happen? And Gordon Graham is a great consultant, speaker. A lot of folks in law enforcement know of him. And one of my favorite sayings of his is, predictable is preventable. So if you can think about it happening, you can think about preventing it from happening, especially if it's a bad thing.
I usually don't quote other consultants when I do my work out in the world, but that is a phrase I remind them of from
Yes,
Gordon Graham.
right.
Um, Recently, you and I had a discussion, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to have some follow-on discussions like this in this forum in the future. But we had a discussion about my experience with technology. I believe in technology. I think technology is great. I think it's a great tool for us. And I'm going to tie this together, I hope, with the telling stories. Excuse me. Um, Technology is wonderful, but I don't know that it goes a long ways to maintaining meaningful relationships in human beings. I don't want to put anything um, in the future. I'm going to stop and cut this right here.
Sure.
I believe in technology, and I believe we should use it. It is a great tool, but I don't want to put my future or the future of any of my client organizations into anything that ceases to exist when the electricity is turned off. And I especially don't want to put that into relationships in that respect. I don't recall if I told you this story, but about 3 years ago, I was, as you know, I travel a lot, and I was in San Francisco, and you know how the seats are on the concourse and out in the gate area. Sometimes they're back to back, and I was sitting there fiddling around with my cell phone, reading the internet, doing whatever I was doing, and there was a woman behind me doing the same thing. And at one point, I turned around in my chair, looking at the floor and my cell phone, and she turned around about that same time. And it took a couple of seconds, and she stopped at a total stranger, and she looked at me and she said, "What happened to us? We used to talk." And I thought, wow, she just gave me one of the greatest analogies for how dangerous. I mean, it's great, technology is great, but man, oh man, look what we could have been doing, learning from one another.
Yes.
And so I guess my question within this other question, the value of telling stories, is this your experience with, my phrase, high tech, high touch. We got to do the high technology.
Right.
That's fine. But the high touch comes from those interpersonal relationships with listening to people, in my world anyway, and I think probably in yours. But what are your thoughts about this balancing with high tech and high touch?
Well, going back to the storytelling pieces, we need that as human beings. We need that high touch. We have to feel included. We have to feel like we're part of the group, and you can't get that. I don't care how hard you try, but you can't get that through a virtual format.
No.
It's just not going to happen. And and so that high touch is very important in that respect, because it feeds a certain internal need that I think we all have to have physical one-on-one associations with people around us. And when you replace that or try to replace that with a smartphone or a computer or some sort of virtual format, you lose that uh, intangible aspect of relationship.
An emotional connection.
An emotional connection, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's probably why you see all the animosity and bickering on social media and the back and forth. People saying things they wouldn't say if they were on one-on-one, because it's like there's all the emotions have been neutralized, and you stop caring about the person on the other end.
Closest we can get to and with social media is writing in all caps. That's about as
Right.
close as we can get to that, right?
Right.
Well, I am sensitive to your time and to the length of this, but I suppose this will come out odd, here we're dealing with, so don't be shocked. But of the discussions we've had today, what would be your hopes for what people might do either in their private lives or in business or government? What would be your hopes that they would do with a discussion such as you and I have just had?
Well, I think the most important thing you can do is understand how important those interpersonal relationships are with the people around you.
Mhm.
Um, it's extremely important that you, even with people you don't disagree with, you have to build those one-on-one interpersonal relationships if you ever really want to get anything done. One of the things that was required in hindsight, in retrospect, for me to have gone as far as I did was having to develop a network of peers, mentors, and subordinates that knew me, could relate to me, trusted me, et cetera, et cetera. And if I hadn't done that, if I hadn't taken the time, if I just sat there on my smartphone or sat behind my computer alone in my office, it never would have happened. I never would have had the opportunities that I had. And I'm just a regular person. I had some terrific opportunities. And there's some great people out there in the world today that are missing some great opportunities and could be of tremendous service to their community in this country, but they've got to get out there and build those relationships so people understand who you are.
Well said. Well said. Um, well, I'm my old friend. Is there anything else you want to talk about for right now?
No, not really.
Okay. Well, I know you have a lot to do,
Oh,
and
well, no, I enjoyed this. I could do this all day long.
so could I.
Name the
So could
subject.
I.
I'd be glad to, chit chat about it. But
So could I. I tell you, let's do it again soon. Um, and maybe follow up on some of these same points, but we'll figure that one out later. Um, I have to tell you, Eric, it's because of people like you, whether your role and as a person
Mhm.
and your values and your character, your experience in law enforcement as a leader, and your experience and expertise in the military. I can travel anywhere in the world, knowing that my family is and my country are in good hands thanks to folks like you. And so I want to thank you for your time. I will post your contact information in a comment section on YouTube when this is uploaded.
Okay.
And ask all the folks who watch this. First of all, thank them for watching and for subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe and encourage other people to subscribe to this channel. All those who are watching it. So, General, I'm going to get on my way. It's my night to cook dinner, and I haven't the slightest idea what that means. But some people are counting on me, so I got to figure it out. Take care of yourself, huh?
Oh, it's been great chatting with you. Thank you.
All right, be safe out there. Talk to you soon.
You too. Bye.